Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. What actually happens when the world's premier military superpower gets outmaneuvered by a regional adversary? Today we're unpacking a really bold thesis from the Geopolitical Economy Report. The analyst, Ben Norton, is presenting a super provocative argument about the recent hostilities between the United States and Iran. According to this report, despite massive military disparities on paper, the United States is actually facing a massive strategic defeat. We're going to look at exactly how the source builds this argument, taking a close look at the evidence they pull from mainstream media, military data, and geopolitical strategy to make their case.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To unpack this sprawling argument, we're going to follow a clear, step-by-step roadmap. We'll start by assessing the core claim of a strategic defeat, then look at shifting rhetoric, vulnerable allies, depleted arsenals, a redrawn military footprint, and finally, the new regional balance.
All right, Section 1, a strategic defeat, assessing the core claim. Now, to build its case, the source doesn't just rely on fringe outlets. They point directly to mainstream Western media. For instance, they highlight this leaked Pentagon email reported by CNN. In the email, an officer in the U.S. Central Command's intelligence branch is literally asking military analysts for creative and unconventional ways to pressure Iran. The analyst uses this as foundational proof that the administration genuinely lacks a concrete, actionable plan for the conflict. They're essentially crowdsourcing ideas out of desperation.
And this isn't just an outlier opinion. The source heavily relies on assessments like this one from the New York Times to anchor its controversial thesis, pointing out that this narrative is becoming widely acknowledged. To further the point, the source cites a Foreign Policy magazine article, actually penned by government-funded think tankers, that advises the U.S. administration on, quote, the diplomatic art of losing well. So the analyst is using these mainstream anchors to show that the idea of a U.S. defeat is becoming a real consensus in foreign policy circles.
Let's move on to Section 2, shifting rhetoric and reality, the administration's messaging.
And this brilliantly illustrates the disconnect the report is talking about. It turns its focus to the White House, highlighting a stark contrast between extreme public threats and sudden diplomatic pivots. On one hand, you have severe rhetoric. The source notes that the administration threatened World War II-level terror. And the analyst even alleges that this matched U.S. military tactics on the ground, making severe claims about intentional strikes on civilian infrastructure. But juxtaposed directly against those massive threats were sudden, contradictory claims from the administration that a peace deal was imminent to reopen the crucial Strait of Hormuz. Claims that, by the way, the Iranian government flatly denied.
To map out this alleged pattern, the source relies on a timeline constructed by University of Chicago professor Robert Pape. The source actually refers to this as the Taco Trump cycle, alleging a pattern of aggressive threats followed by rapid retreats. Just look at this progression. A 48-hour deadline in March, threats to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age in April, renewed threats in June, sudden claims of a probable deal in July, and then World War II-level threats in August followed immediately by a sudden halt. The analyst argues this constant flip-flopping proves the U.S. just has no viable way to end the crisis on its own terms.
Which brings us to Section 3. Vulnerable Middle Eastern allies, pressures for de-escalation.
So, you might be wondering, why the sudden pullbacks? Well, the source claims that major U.S. allies in the region, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE, were actually begging Washington to de-escalate. Why? Because of their own massive infrastructural vulnerabilities. The analyst details a few critical pressure points here. First, desalination plants. Gulf monarchies get over 90% of their drinking water from these facilities. If the U.S. targets Iranian grids, Iran could easily retaliate by hitting these water supplies. Second, their oil infrastructure. The source points out that Yemen, allied with Iran, has already targeted Saudi oil transport networks heading to the Red Sea. And finally, the Strait of Hormuz, the transit point for a full 20% of the world's global oil supply. For you and me, a disruption there doesn't just mean a localized conflict. It means an immediate, massive spike in global gas prices and inflation. The report argues these existential vulnerabilities make U.S. allies absolutely desperate to avoid a broader conflict.
Let's look at the hard data in Section 4. Depleted U.S. military arsenals, the numbers behind the strategy.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it shows diplomatic pressure isn't the only factor holding the U.S. back. The report introduces hard data on military stockpiles. Look at the dramatic drop in Professor Pape's data regarding Patriot missile interceptors. These are absolutely crucial air defense tools used to shoot down incoming threats. At the start of the hostilities on February 28th, the U.S. had 2,330 of these interceptors. By April 8th, that number plummeted to around 1,000. And by the end of July, the stockpile had dwindled to just 800.
Citing CNN reporting, the analyst highlights a truly staggering figure, 80%. The U.S. military has burned through nearly 80% of its key missile interceptors in this conflict alone. And the report stresses that rebuilding the stockpile isn't some quick fix. It would literally take years, leaving the U.S. highly exposed in the short term.
And it's not just the Patriot missiles. The source pulls data from Reuters to show the depletion of offensive and long-range weapons as well. Roughly half of the interceptors for the THAAD system, which is a massive, critical piece of the U.S. air defense shield, are gone. The U.S. has used up nearly 50% of its entire global supply of Tomahawk missiles, and virtually all of its long-range ATACMS precision missiles have been depleted. The analyst argues this severe logistical reality is a primary unspoken reason why the U.S. was repeatedly forced to call off its massive threatened escalations.
Moving right along to Section 5, redrawing the military footprint, shifting base locations. So this massive logistical strain ties directly into a geographic displacement. Quoting an Iran expert featured in the Financial Times, the report outlines Tehran's alleged long-term strategy. The goal is to expect a long war and systematically exhaust the U.S. military presence, forcing them out of neighboring countries like Kuwait and Bahrain and pushing them back into Jordan, Israel, or even all the way to Europe. And according to the analyst, this isn't just a theory, it's actively happening.
To validate this claim, the source points to a rather surreal New York Times headline noting that U.S. troops were essentially forced to work remotely. Yeah, remotely. After regional bases were damaged by retaliatory strikes, American soldiers actually had to retreat to civilian hotels, office spaces, and civilian ports. Furthermore, thousands of troops were reportedly withdrawn from the region entirely and sent to Europe, trying to manage the conflict from thousands of kilometers away.
Let's move to Section 6 and see how this builds into the final picture, the new regional balance.
So how does this all synthesize into the analyst's ultimate conclusion? It's perfectly encapsulated in this Financial Times quote right here. The analyst firmly argues that it is Iran, not the United States, that is taking the initiative, dictating the pace, and setting the terms of the conflict. By playing a long game of exhaustion, Tehran is allegedly neutralizing U.S. military superiority. To wrap up this sprawling thesis, the source leans on a pretty brutal assessment from the New York Times editorial board. They conclude that U.S. goals in the conflict remain completely unmet. The military is running short on the exact armaments it needs for global reach. Crucially, that vital Strait of Hormuz is effectively under Iranian control. And ultimately, the conduct in the war has left the U.S. viewed internationally as an unpredictable instrument of global disorder, leaving both Washington and its regional allies in a much weaker position, diplomatically and militarily. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've walked through this source's intricate argument, from depleted missile stockpiles to shifting base locations and vulnerable allies. But we want to leave you with a provocative question to really think about. If this analysis holds true, and the U.S. has indeed suffered a strategic defeat that limits its leverage in the Middle East, how will a weakened Washington have to reshape its global alliances moving forward? It's absolutely a critical question for the future of global security. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.